Tokaimura precipitation tank. On September 30th, 1999, at the JCO fuel conversion plant in Tokai, Ibaraki Prefecture, Japan. It was mid-morning, and a conversion crew was working through the last steps of a uranium fuel batch against a shipping deadline. Hisashi Ouchi was 35, a conversion technician at the plant. Masato Shinohara, 40, worked beside him. Their supervisor, Yutaka Yokokawa, 54, sat at a desk about 4 meters back. The job was to get uranyl nitrate solution into a precipitation tank, and they were doing it by hand, pouring from stainless steel buckets. Ouchi stood at the tank holding a funnel while Shinohara poured. The approved procedure didn't work like this. It required the solution to be held in a buffer tank and pumped across in 2.4 kilogram increments, a limit set so the uranium could never gather into a shape that would sustain a chain reaction. The buckets skipped all of that. They added the 7th one. The tank came up to roughly 16 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 18.8%. At 10:35 in the morning, it went critical. There was a blue flash. Gamma alarms sounded across the building. Ouchi was closest, leaning over the tank, and he took 17 sieverts. Shinohara took 10. Yokokawa, at his desk, took 3. 8 is generally considered enough to kill anyone. Ouchi collapsed and began vomiting. The 3 were carried out and driven to the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba, and Ouchi and Shinohara were moved on to the University of Tokyo Hospital. Within hours, 161 people inside a 350-meter radius were evacuated, and about 300,000 more were told to stay indoors. The bucket method hadn't been improvised that morning. Investigators found it written into an unauthorized in-house manual. The 16 kilograms in the tank was nearly 7 times the legal mass limit. Doctors found Ouchi's chromosomes shattered. His body had lost the ability to make new cells. He was given transfusions and skin grafts for 83 days. According to NHK's account of the case, about a week in, he told his doctors, "I can't take it anymore. I am not a guinea pig." His heart stopped and was restarted repeatedly at his family's request, until they decided against reviving him again. Hisashi Ouchi died of multi-organ failure on December 21st, 1999, 83 days after the flash. Shinohara died the following April, and in 2001, 6 JCO employees pleaded guilty to negligence resulting in death, along with the company president. JCO lost its operating license, the first time Japan had ever done that to a nuclear operator. The plant never reopened. Goiânia cesium capsule. On September 13, 1987, in Goiânia, in the Brazilian state of Goiás, a private radiotherapy clinic had shut down 2 years earlier, and the building it left behind stood half demolished and open to the street. 2 scavengers, Roberto dos Santos and Wagner Mota Pereira, went in looking for scrap metal and hauled a heavy assembly out of an abandoned teletherapy unit. They sold it to a scrapyard on Rua 26, owned by Dever Alves Ferreira. His wife, Maria Gabriela Ferreira, was 37, and she lived and worked at the yard. Inside the assembly was a sealed capsule of cesium-137 chloride. Someone punctured it. What came out was a powder that glowed blue in the dark, about 50.9 terabecquerels, roughly 1,375 curies. Dever was delighted with it. He invited friends and family to the yard to look at it. The powder was handed around, carried into houses, rubbed on skin. His 6-year-old niece, Laida das Neves Ferreira, ate a sandwich with it on her hands. Within days, people across the neighborhood were vomiting and losing their hair. Maria Gabriela was the one who worked it out. She noticed that everyone who had been near the powder was sick at the same time. On September 28th, she went to the rival scrapyard, where part of the assembly had been resold, took the remains back, put them in a plastic bag, and carried them across the city by bus to the health department. The next day, a visiting medical physicist, Walter Mendes Ferreira, put a scintillation counter on it, and the reading confirmed what she'd brought in. The clinic's owners had moved out in 1985 and left the source behind, and never told the authorities it was there. Around 112,000 people were eventually screened, and 249 were found contaminated. Topsoil was stripped from whole lots. Houses were demolished. Maria Gabriela Ferreira died of septicemia and generalized infection on October 23, 1987, at the Marcílio Dias Naval Hospital in Rio de Janeiro. Her niece Laida died the same day, Israel Batista dos Santos 4 days later, and Admilson Alves de Souza the day after that. In a ruling issued in March 2000, a court found the clinic's operators responsible, but without criminal intent, and nobody went to prison. The cleanup produced about 3,500 cubic meters of radioactive waste. It sits in a repository at Abadia de Goiás, 20 kilometers outside the city, still monitored today. Los Alamos Demon Core. On May 21, 1946, at the Omega Site Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, it was 20 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, and a demonstration was scheduled for a physicist who was taking over the work. Louis Slotin was 35, a Canadian physicist from Winnipeg. He'd assembled the core for the Trinity test, and he was known for doing criticality work by hand, faster than anyone at the site. He was leaving Los Alamos, and he was training his replacement, Alvin Graves, who stood at his right shoulder. 7 other people were in the room. On the table was a plutonium sphere. Slotin lowered a beryllium half-shell over it, holding the shell with his left thumb through a hole in the top, keeping it from closing with the blade of a flathead screwdriver in his right hand. The screwdriver slipped outward a fraction of an inch. The shell dropped closed. The room filled with a blue flash and a wave of heat. Slotin jerked his left hand up, threw the shell to the floor, and stopped the reaction. It had lasted a fraction of a second. Los Alamos later put his dose at around 10 grays of neutron radiation, though published estimates vary widely. His own body had taken most of it, and shielded the men behind him. Slotin walked outside and vomited. Then he came back in and marked out on the floor exactly where every man had been standing, so their doses could be worked out, and he told Graves he thought he'd be all right. Enrico Fermi had reportedly warned Slotin and the others that if they kept running the test that way, they'd be dead within a year. This was the second time the same plutonium core had killed a man in 9 months. Harry Daghlian, 24, had dropped a tungsten carbide brick onto it on August 21, 1945, and died 25 days later. After Slotin, the staff started calling it the Demon Core. Louis Slotin died at Los Alamos on May 30, 1946, 9 days after the flash. His body went home to Winnipeg in a sealed casket, and hands-on criticality testing at the site ended for good. The core was never used in a weapon. It was melted down that summer, and the plutonium was recycled into other cores. Tyler Therac, 25. On March 21, 1986, at the East Texas Cancer Center in Tyler, Texas, a radiation therapy session was booked that morning. Ray Cox was 33, an oil field worker. He'd had a tumor taken out of his upper back, and he was in for his 9th follow-up treatment. He lay face down on the table, and the operator went out to the console. She typed in X for X-ray mode, realized she wanted electron mode, moved the cursor up, typed in E, and hit return. She'd done it thousands of times, and she was fast. That was the problem. The software had a flaw that surfaced when an operator edited the mode faster than the magnets could reposition, about 8 seconds. Her correction beat them. The console said the beam was set for electrons. The machine fired a raw, unfiltered X-ray beam instead. Cox felt what he described as an electric shock in his back, saw a flash of light, and heard a frying sound. The console displayed malfunction 54 and reported an underdose. The operator pressed proceed. The machine fired again and hit him a second time. The video monitor was unplugged and the intercom was broken, so she couldn't see him or hear him. He got off the table, went to the door, and beat on it. He was sent home. Over the following weeks, he lost the use of his left arm, then his vocal cords and his diaphragm. The center's physicist, Fritz Hager, reproduced the fault with the operator and found the trigger was typing speed. Reconstructions put what Cox took at between 16,500 and 25,000 rads into about 1 square centimeter in under a second. A full course of therapy is 6,000 rads over weeks. The manufacturer had told the hospital in writing that the machine was incapable of delivering an excess dose. The same error caught a second Tyler patient 3 weeks later. Verdon Kidd, 66, a bus driver, died on May 1st. Ray Cox died roughly 5 months later, in the late summer of 1986. The FDA declared the machine defective, and it was withdrawn. U.S. Radium Dial Studio. In 1917, in Orange, New Jersey, at the dial painting studio of what would become the United States Radium Corporation, more than 100 workers, most of them young women, sat at long tables painting luminous numerals onto watch faces. Amelia Maggia, known as Molly, was one of them. She'd started in her late teens. The brushes were fine camel hair, and to keep the tip sharp, the painters were taught to shape it with their lips. Dip, point with the mouth, paint. The company told them the paint was harmless. In 1921, Molly got a toothache. Her dentist pulled the tooth. Then the tooth next to it began to hurt, and that one came out too. The sockets didn't heal. Ulcers spread across her gums and jaw. By May of 1922, her lower jaw, the roof of her mouth, and some of the bone in her ears had become, in her doctor's description, one large abscess. Her dentist lifted her jawbone out of her mouth. Not by surgery, it came away in his fingers. On September 12, 1922, at about 5 in the afternoon, the tissue in her mouth gave way, and she hemorrhaged. Her nurse couldn't stop it. She was 24. Her death certificate said syphilis. In 1925, the Essex County Medical Examiner, Harrison Martland, developed a test that found radium in the dial painter's breath and bones. Radium is a chemical cousin of calcium. Their bodies had filed what they swallowed into their bones and kept it there, irradiating them from the inside. In 1927, Molly's body was exhumed. It was radioactive throughout. The syphilis on her certificate was wrong, and US Radium had used that diagnosis to discredit the women who got sick. In May that year, Grace Fryer sued the company, joined by Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and Molly's sisters, Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. They settled in June 1928 for $10,000 each, their costs, and $600 a year for life. Grace Fryer was dead 5 years later. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, so the women's bones are radioactive still. Wood River Junction evaporator. On July 24, 1964, at the United Nuclear Corporation's scrap recovery plant at Wood River Junction in Charlestown, Rhode Island, the plant pulled enriched uranium out of scrap, and it had been open less than 4 months. Robert Peabody was 37, a production technician there. He'd taken the job as a second income. He and his wife Anna had 9 children. Peabody was working with a tank of sodium carbonate solution, and the job called for adding trichloroethane to strip out the organics. He picked up a bottle and poured it in. The bottle held concentrated uranium-235 solution, not trichloroethane. It had been sitting in the wrong place, in an unmarked container of the same kind used for the solvent. The tank went critical. The blast threw him to the floor and splashed radioactive liquid off the 12-foot ceiling and back over him. He took about 10,000 rads, 1,000 times a lethal dose, and more radiation than anyone had absorbed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He ran from the building and was found outside, already vomiting. An ambulance took him first to Westerly Hospital, which had nothing to treat him with, then onto Rhode Island Hospital in Providence, 45 miles away. 90 minutes after the flash, a plant manager went back in and switched off the agitator, which set off a second excursion and exposed him and another administrator to up to 100 rads. Both survived. The containers couldn't be told apart by shape or marking. Robert Peabody died in an isolation room at Rhode Island Hospital on July 26, 1964, 49 hours after the flash. The Atomic Energy Commission charged United Nuclear with 14 violations of nuclear safety regulations, 8 of them directly involved in the accident, and no fine was ever levied. The doctors who treated him published his case in the New England Journal of Medicine the following April. They wrote that acute radiation syndrome would almost surely be encountered from time to time as the nuclear industry expanded. 60 years on, Robert Peabody is still the only person it has killed in the American commercial nuclear industry. Pripyat Fire Brigade 6. On April 26, 1986, just past 1 in the morning, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant outside Pripyat in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The night was warm and clear. 4 kilometers away in the town, a fire station's duty watch was asleep. Vasily Ignatenko was 25, a senior sergeant with Paramilitary Fire Brigade No. 6. He'd been married to Ludmila for 2.5 years, and she was pregnant with their first child. At 23 minutes and 58 seconds past 1, Reactor 4 exploded. The lid came off, 1,000 tons of it, and superheated graphite and fuel fragments were thrown across the site, starting more than 30 separate fires. The call came in at 1:29. Ignatenko was among the first 9 firefighters out of the station. They arrived to find fires on the roofs of the ventilation block and Reactor 3, next to the open reactor. They were told it was a roof fire, an electrical fire. Nobody told them the reactor core was lying open. They went up the Reactor 3 fire escape, 20 stories, in canvas and rubber, carrying hoses. They worked in it for hours, kicking burning graphite off the roof by hand and by boot. The graphite was pieces of the reactor core. The men started vomiting on the roof. Ignatenko came down and collapsed. He was taken to the Pripyat hospital at around 2:35 in the morning, then flown from Kyiv to Moscow to Hospital Number 6, the Soviet Union's Radiation Medicine Center. On May 2nd, he was given a bone marrow transplant, and his older sister was the donor. His younger sister, Natasha, had been called in first and turned down. She was 13. The explosion had followed a safety test on Reactor 4, run at low power with the emergency cooling system switched off. The reactor's control rods had graphite tips, and the first movement of inserting them to shut it down briefly increased the reaction instead of stopping it. The firefighters had no dosimeters that read high enough and nothing on them that would stop gamma radiation. The doses that killed them were absorbed in the first minutes on the roof. Vasily Ignatenko died at 11:20 in the morning on May 13, 1986, 18 days after the call. He was one of 28 workers and firefighters who died of acute radiation syndrome in the weeks after the accident. On May 15th, he was buried at Matinskoye Cemetery in Moscow, in a zinc coffin inside a wooden one, and he was posthumously given the Order of the Red Banner. Ludmila stayed with him in the hospital for all 18 days, and nobody stopped her. Their daughter Natasha was born a few months later with heart defects and cirrhosis of the liver. She lived 4 hours. She was buried with her father. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, and let me know what to cover next in the comments.